It would seem that even though it happened, it seemed that there would be the opposite reaction in a sense, because since there was more productivity, you would think that wages would increase or that people would demand that anyway. So I don't know, I just had an argument with somebody about that this week when we were discussing.
But yes, if I can rephrase your question, and if I do violence to it, correct me. If you're saying that the rising productivity would have, in a sense, made it possible for the employer to give some of that gain in output back to the worker in the form of a rising wage, absolutely, that's what had been going on for the previous 150 years. So, yes, it could have happened. And you're also right that workers, had they been ever presented with the question, would you like that to happen? My guess is most workers, like me, would have said, absolutely, I wish this to continue. I would rather have rising wages as the reward for my harder and harder work, just as my parents and grandparents and the generations before me wanted and got that. I would like to keep that all going. So yeah, I don't think this is a question of workers not wanting it, and I don't think it's a question of employers not being able, if you like, to use that word, to do it. They were able, precisely because the productivity lines kept rising. Here, by the way, they're all rising at the same rate. That's not historically accurate. They go at different rates. But to make the story simple, I'm keeping the lines roughly the same. The gap here widening, that is the case. Right? So that we know that employers, they weren't mean-spirited, but they took advantage of the labor market. They didn't have to raise wages. They had lots of people available competing for the jobs, and so they found all the usual reasons people can find to not do something that somewhere in the back of their mind they might have thought they ought to have done. But, if you don't have to pay your workers more, you don't.
So like increased labor force, more people available, not that sense of like competitiveness as far as wages.
That's right. You had an excess of people. You had lots of people. If this one didn't work out, there were lots. You knew that if you put an ad in the local paper, there'd be 10 people that would probably, half of them have as good credentials as the one that was giving you a problem here. And so you didn't. And you made sure that you didn't, and that made the union look bad, because the union wasn't able to get higher wages. And so the union began to be a burden in people's eyes. I don't like paying my dues to a union. It doesn't do. Nothing's happening to us. So screw the union. People weren't that interested in unions to begin with in America for lots of complicated reasons. So it didn't take all that much to push them away. So the unions began to look bad, and they got weaker. And that, of course, made the employer even freer not to give higher. It fed on itself, as I said. Yeah.
The actual juncture when that change took place,
yes,
when the wages no longer increased,
right,
was that the crisis? Was that 1973, or was that that the baby boomers were all of a sudden working age, or was it just a conjunction of all those?
All those things. All those things. Really. And don't look for a particular year. It's across the 70s. Some people like to say it's in the early part when the crisis hit. Usually the big crisis year of the 70s is considered to be 1974. And when the crisis here in New York went almost bankrupt if you go back and you read the stories. Other people say, no, it really happens a little later in 77. It doesn't really matter. It's in that period that this happens. Huh?
The outsourcing
also begins then, and so some people like to point to that. And remember also, all the statistics in economics, all of them, are fuzzy. They have a lovely precision when you open a book like the government record, and there is a lovely table that gives you all these nice numbers right to the fourth decimal place. But these are not, don't get fetishized here. These numbers are collected by people who ask questions out in the field and who write down the answers, and then they collate them, and then somebody manipulates those numbers and someone else extrapolates them, and then it appears in the table. In the table it's nice and crisp and precise. The origins are very fuzzy. There's lots of debates. If you're ever interested, there's something that the United States Labor Department issues a journal called the Monthly Labor Review. And in it, you will see almost every other issue, if you go, and it's free on the internet, you'll see debates by economists and statisticians. What does the employment number really represent? We shouldn't say it represents this, because if you look at how the data are collected and who collects them and when they're collected, it skews it this way or that. And then they argue with each other. This one says we should collect them this way. And if you collect them this way, the unemployment rate really is X. Whereas if you collect it this way, the unemployment rate is really Y. What's the right unemployment rate? The answer is there is no right one. Depends on what you think you ought to be counting, how you think you ought to be counting, how you think you ought to be mathematically processing the information you gather. And those are always debates. And people change. One of the reasons it's very hard to get a long-term view of wages is that what wages were understood to be and how the information was gathered changes. Sometimes it changes because a new idea of how to count comes up. Sometimes it changes because politicians want to fudge the numbers because they don't want unemployment to be growing when they're running for office. They'd like it to be shrinking, and so they work out a reamend. There were a lot of accusations of the Bush administration that it was doing that. I don't know whether they're true or not. Those are accusations that are often made. I'm sure they were made by the Republicans vis-a-vis Clinton before, and so on. But some of that goes on, and you'd have to do an awful lot of work, which I haven't done, and neither have the reporters who give you the numbers, as to what also, in order to come to some kind of consensus about it. And as I say, the experts are continuously arguing. If you go to the annual meetings of the American Association of Statisticians, you'll see that many of the panels at their annual meetings are debates over what statistics are being published, what their relationship is with their purported underlying realities, blah, blah, blah. So just always keep a kind of looseness in your own thinking about what you do with these numbers. If you have an argument that depends ruthlessly on a number, you're on very thin ice, very dangerous. You're going to find people shooting at you left and right about your argument who are quarreling with your data. I mean, you can always do that, and people always do. And there's always something to it. I'm not saying don't use it. I mean, obviously, I'm using some numbers here, but I'm stressing they're very rough, and that's all. I don't want to make claims that depend on a precision that isn't there. Okay. All right. So the first thing is profits went crazy. And I want to stress with you that the profits that went crazy everywhere. Please, again, this is not a depiction of profits that happened in the finance industry or in banks, or it happened everywhere. Wherever there's an employer and employees, this phenomena, more or less, it varies, of course, with each industry and each enterprise, but in general, this was a process that all employers took advantage of as much as they could, and that all employees lived with as much and as best as they could. So it is not fair to refer to this, as you'll see, as a financial crisis, since, as I'm going to show you, and as you've already seen, it's this phenomena that lies at the foundation of the crisis we're in. That's what we just went through. Workers who had to live through this experience, all workers across the economy, had to struggle with what we've seen, with changing family, with the pressures on the women, with the pressures on their budgets, with the pressure of their debts, etc., across the board. So this is a phenomenon that affected all workers across the economy, and this profit is something that was enjoyed by all employers, more or less, for a 30-year period. Okay, now let's follow the ball. Let's see what it means if employers have profits like that. What happens? First thing, money starts to accumulate in the accounts at the bank of corporations. Their profit account, the money in the bank that they don't need immediately to pay out in wages or to pay out in buying supplies, the profits, the discretionary fund that the board of directors is going to decide what to do with, this is becoming nice and big, and it's sitting in a bank. So right away, the banks are noticing that the thing that's really dramatic, the growth in the accounts, are the accounts of corporate profits, a kind of discretionary fund where often the corporation seeks the advice of the banker as to how profitably to invest it, since that's in a sense what they do with it. Second, we begin to see, starting in these 1970s, and particularly in the 80s and 90s, an explosion, historically unprecedented, of payment of huge new salary increases to top managers. There's an immense amount of literature about this. I'm sure you've all seen it. You read about it. You hear about it. Various people morally defend it. Others variously morally denounce it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the interesting thing, all I want you to see is it takes off then. We begin to get these CEO corporate packages that blow your mind, millions of dollars a year, either in direct salary payment or stock options or incentive programs and so forth and so on, kind of going out of all proportion. And if you look at the numbers, the most famous one that's used around the world is the numerical relationship between what a CEO gets and the average salary of a non-supervisory worker in an enterprise. So instead of going, I don't know what the numbers are, it's not in my head, but in the 1970s, let's say, the average ratio between what the CEO gets and the average of a non-supervisory worker might have been in the realm of 10 to 1, something like that. And then by 2000, it's in the realm of 200 to 1, something like that. Really off the chart, just to show you a sign of the gap. And we get a whole culture, I don't have the time to do it, a whole culture that celebrates this. Kind of euphoria set in. And the reason I stress it to you is that's very typical of capitalist cycles. When things are going well, there's a kind of hyping that gets revved up. It's almost like going, to a football game, and if your side is really getting all the touchdowns, you can kind of get carried away with the wonderfulness. That's why it's so shocking when your quarterback keels over or whatever it is that happens that's not so good, because you really weren't expecting